An ordinary hill sits beneath a hard, empty sky. No towers rise from it, no doorway waits in the open air, but under the dust and broken stones lies something older than cities, older than writing, older than kings, a buried sanctuary, carved with animals and raised by people who should not have been able to build it. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if ancient mysteries like this are the kind of stories you enjoy. At first, the hill looks harmless, almost empty, the kind of rise a traveller might pass without slowing down. It stands under a hard sky, rounded by wind and time, with stones scattered across its back like the bones of some ordinary ruin. Grass grows thinly between the rocks. Dust gathers in the shallow folds of the ground. From a distance, there is nothing about it that demands wonder. No standing columns pierce the horizon. No broken walls climb above the slope. No great doorway waits in the open air. The place seems silent in the way many old landscapes seem silent, as if whatever once happened there has been worn smooth by weather and forgotten by the living. But beneath that calm surface, the hill is not behaving like a natural hill. Its shape is too deliberate. Its soil holds too many broken stones. Here and there, the ground gives up fragments that do not look like chance. A carved edge, a worked surface, a heavy block half swallowed by earth. The first feeling is not certainty, it is unease. Something is underneath. The ancient mound keeps its secret with extraordinary patience. For thousands of years, wind moves over it, rains strike it, animals cross it, roots push into it, and generations live and die without knowing that below their feet lies a place built by hands from a world almost impossibly distant from our own. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this is not the story of a palace uncovered in a famous empire, or a tomb packed with gold, or a lost city whose name survives in royal records. This is the story of a buried sanctuary older than writing, older than metal, older than the first cities, older than the settled kingdoms that usually define the beginning of civilization. It waits in the earth from a time when human beings are often imagined as small bands moving through wild landscapes, following animals, gathering plants, building temporary shelters and leaving behind only stone tools, bones, hearths, and traces so slight that archaeology must listen very carefully to hear them. What makes the hill unsettling is that it seems to contradict the expected order of things. In the familiar version of the human story, people first learn to farm, then settle in villages, then accumulate food, then organize labor, then build monuments, temples, walls, and sacred places. Agriculture creates surplus. Surplus creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates priests, rulers, builders, and the monuments that announce them. It is a clean sequence, almost too clean. And for a long time it feels logical. But beneath this mound, the stones suggest something stranger. They suggest that people who have not yet become city dwellers, who do not yet have pottery in the familiar settled sense, who do not yet leave behind kings or armies or written prayers, gather here and raise pillars weighing many tons. They carve animals into their surfaces with patient skill. They arrange them in circles and enclosures. Then, after generations of use, they cover the place with soil and rubble so thoroughly that the sanctuary disappears into a hill. Even before excavation reveals the full shape of the buried place, the land offers hints that the mound is artificial. It is not merely bedrock under a thin skin of soil. It is made in part from fill, from debris, from deliberately accumulated material. Stones emerge where they should not. Some lie broken, but not randomly. Others show surfaces made flat by tools. The evidence remains incomplete at first, as it always does at the beginning of a discovery. But the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Ancient people have changed this hill. They have not just visited it, they have built into it, buried within it, and reshaped it until architecture and landscape become one. The surrounding country deepens the mystery. The temple does not hide in a dense modern city, beneath layers of continuous urban life, where one expects ruins to pile on top of ruins. It rises in open country on a high limestone ridge, where the view stretches outward over plains and distant hills. In the clear light, the landscape feels exposed, almost severe. Yet this exposed place once stands near a world far richer than it may first appear. In the late Ice Age and the early warming millennia that follow, this region is not an empty wasteland. It is a zone of wild grasses, pistachio and almond trees in places, grazing animals, birds, predators, seasonal water, and human movement. It is a crossroads of ecological opportunity. People come through, not as lost wanderers, but as skilled observers of land and season. They know where herds pass, where plants ripen, where stone can be worked, where water can be found, and where the horizon itself may carry meaning. Still, knowing a landscape is not the same as deciding to raise a monument inside it. That decision points to something more than survival. The stones below the mound do not look like the practical remains of a camp. They do not resemble a simple shelter thrown together against weather. They speak of effort that exceeds immediate need. Large pillars must be cut from limestone, separated from bedrock, moved across uneven ground, set upright, and surrounded by walls or benches. This is labour performed with planning. It requires food, time, cooperation, memory, and a reason powerful enough to bring people back. No single explanation fully accounts for this. A place may be sacred, social, political, ancestral, seasonal, or all of these at once. But whatever name we choose, the buried temple suggests that human imagination is already gathering people into something larger than the daily hunt. One of the strangest features of the mound is its concealment. Many ancient monuments are ruined by neglect, invasion, earthquake, or reuse. Stones are robbed, walls collapse, fires sweep through, and later builders carry away what they can. Here the story appears different. Much of the sanctuary is preserved not because it remains open to the world, but because it is swallowed. The same earth that hides it also protects it. Fill presses around the pillars, broken stone, animal bone. Flint debris and soil pack the enclosures. Over time, the buried architecture becomes sealed away from ordinary destruction. This gives the site an almost paradoxical character. It survives because it vanishes. To stand at the beginning of this story is to stand before a hill that does not yet explain itself. The eye sees dust, limestone, weeds, and a slope warmed by the sun. The mind begins to sense an arrangement beneath. There is a tension between the plainness of the surface and the magnitude of what lies below it. Scholars still debate many details of such places who gathered there, how often they came, what they believed, why animals dominate the carvings, and why the stones were finally buried. But the first revelation is simple and profound. The ground is not empty. The hill is a cover. Under it lies a human decision made thousands of years before the first empires learned to write their victories in stone. And so the mystery begins not with an inscription, not with a king's name, not with a treasure chamber glittering in torchlight, but with a shape in the land that refuses to be ordinary. The mound waits like a closed book whose pages are made of dust and limestone. Every fragment lifted from it will have to be read carefully, because there is no ancient voice explaining what it means. There are only stones, bones, cuts in bedrock, carved animals, buried circles, and the long silence between their world and ours. The temple has survived, but it has survived without surrendering itself easily. It has kept the most important part of its story hidden just below the surface, where the first touch of a tool against earth begins to turn a hill back into a place. Before the first pillar rises, before the mound becomes a hidden chamber of stone and memory, the land itself is already shaping the people who move across it. The ridge does not stand apart from the world around it. It belongs to a broad, restless borderland between uplands and plains, between colder ancient conditions and the warming age that follows the last great ice age. From its height, the eye can travel far. In one direction, open country spreads beneath the sky. In another, broken hills gather shadows in their folds. Seasonal streams cut through the lower ground when rains are generous, then shrink back when heat returns. The air carries dust, plant scent, animal musk, and the faint mineral dryness of limestone. It is not a gentle garden, but it is not an empty wilderness either. It is a living map of food, danger, water, shelter, stone, and memory. The people who know this landscape do not see it as scenery. They read it with the attention of survival. A patch of grass is not just a patch of grass. It may tell where gazelles have passed. A stand of trees may mean nuts, shade, birds, insects, and wood. A scatter of flint nodules may mean tools waiting to be struck into blades. A slope facing the morning sun may dry faster after rain. A hollow may hold water longer than expected. The land is full of signals, and those who miss them do not last. What survives in the record suggests that late hunter-gatherer communities in this region are not primitive figures drifting without plan, but highly skilled people moving through a known world with inherited roots, seasonal knowledge, and social connections stretching farther than a single campfire. To imagine this world properly, one must remove many familiar signs of civilization. There are no roads in the later imperial sense, no cities with gates, no fields neatly divided by property lines, no written boundary stones, no temples with priests recorded by name. But absence should not be mistaken for emptiness. There are meeting places, pathways, favoured camps, hunting grounds, stone sources, burial customs, and probably stories tied to particular hills and springs. The evidence remains incomplete, because such lives leave lighter traces than palaces and brick cities. Yet archaeology has shown again and again that people without writing can possess elaborate memory systems, wide social networks, and sacred geographies that do not need inscriptions to be real. The climate is changing, and that change matters. For thousands of years before the temple's construction, human life across Southwest Asia is shaped by cold phases, dry spells, and the unpredictable rhythms of the late Pleistocene. Then the world begins to warm, ice retreats far to the north, rainfall patterns shift, plant zones move, animals adjust their ranges. Some old ways become harder, while new opportunities appear. In this region, wild cereals grow in natural stands, and their presence will one day become central to the farming revolution. But at this stage, they are still wild plants among many resources, harvested by people who understand ripening seasons long before they domesticate the grain. The future is present in the landscape, but only as possibility. The animals are everywhere in the story, even before they appear carved into stone. Gazelles move in herds across open ground. Wild cattle, larger and more dangerous than their domestic descendants, occupy the imagination as much as the terrain. Wild boar root through thickets. Foxes slip along edges. Birds rise from wetlands and seasonal pools. Snakes warm themselves on stone. Scorpions hide in cracks. Predators follow the same living map as humans, alert to weakness and movement. Later, many of these creatures will appear on the temple pillars, not as casual decoration, but as figures chosen with care. Scholars still debate whether they represent clan symbols, dangerous powers, mythic beings, seasonal signs, or something stranger and more layered. But their presence begins here, in the daily encounter between human bodies and a world crowded with other living forces. The ridge itself offers stone, and stone offers permanence. Limestone is not rare in the region, but not every outcrop is equally useful. The builders who will come later understand the material intimately. They know how it breaks, how it can be shaped, how a pillar can be separated from bedrock without metal tools, and how a surface can be smoothed enough to receive carving. Long before the great enclosures are buried, the land provides the raw grammar of the monument: earth, stone, animal. Horizon and gathering all exist before architecture. The temple does not descend from nowhere. It grows out of a landscape that already carries practical and symbolic weight. There is a lesser-known tension in this ancient setting. Abundance does not always mean ease. A rich seasonal environment can support gatherings, but it can also demand careful timing. Plants ripen briefly, herds migrate, water appears and disappears, cold snaps, droughts, disease, and conflict may interrupt expected patterns. A group that gathers too long in one place must be fed. A feast requires planning. A large work party requires coordination. The very richness of the land may create both opportunity and pressure. When people return again and again to a ridge like this, they are not stepping outside the needs of survival. They are reorganizing survival around memory, obligation, ritual, and perhaps competition. Human communities in this period are also changing in ways that are difficult to see directly. They may still hunt and gather, but some are becoming more settled for longer parts of the year. In surrounding regions, archaeologists find signs of increasingly substantial buildings, storage practices, grinding stones, and intensive use of wild grains. These developments do not happen everywhere at the same speed, and no single explanation fully accounts for them. Climate, population, social life, ritual, technology, and chance all play their part. The old division between wandering hunter and settled farmer becomes too simple. Instead, there is a broad zone of experimentation, where people test new relationships with place. The future temple belongs to that zone of experiment. Its landscape is not merely a backdrop but an active force. The high ridge makes the place visible. The views connect people to distance. The stone offers material. The animals offer food, danger, and imagery. The shifting climate unsettles older patterns and opens new ones. Wild grains stand nearby in the wider region, waiting to become something more than seasonal harvest. Communities moving through this world may already know that certain places hold people together. They may gather not only because food is available, but because the place itself has become necessary. And so, before there is a buried sanctuary, there is a world ready to receive one. The temple begins as a relationship between people and land, between hunger and imagination, between the practical knowledge of hunters and the deeper pull of places that seem to gather meaning. The first builders do not arrive on an empty stage. They arrive in a landscape full of tracks, weather, stone, memory, and animals watching from the edge of human firelight. The hill that will one day hide carved pillars is already part of their mental world. Long before earth seals the monument, the land has been preparing the mystery. The people who raise the first great stones do not arrive as citizens of a city. They do not march under a king's emblem or obey orders written on clay tablets. There is no palace behind them, no tax office counting grain, no army clearing the road, no bureaucracy assigning labour by decree. The usual machinery of monument building, the machinery familiar from Egypt, Mesopotamia, or later empires, has not yet appeared, and yet the stones rise. That is what makes the buried temple so difficult to place within the older, simpler story of civilization. It seems to belong to a world that should not yet be able to make it, and still there it is, cut into limestone, arranged with care, and filled with images that suggest a mind already reaching far beyond the demands of shelter and food. These builders live near the threshold between hunter-gatherer life and the first long experiments with settlement. They may move seasonally, but they are not rootless. They may hunt wild animals, but they are not merely chasing hunger across an unknown land. They know the region deeply, and they likely belong to communities connected by kinship, exchange, marriage, obligation, and memory. Some groups may remain mobile for part of the year, while others stay longer in favoured locations where food, water, and social life make return worthwhile. The evidence remains incomplete, but the old image of scattered bands too small or too simple for ambitious projects no longer holds. These people can gather, they can plan, they can persuade one another to work for purposes that do not immediately fill the stomach. What they lack is almost as important as what they possess. They do not have metal chisels. Their toolkits depend on stone, bone, wood, fibre, and muscle. They do not have draft animals to pull heavy loads. The great domestic beasts that later transform transport and farming are not yet part of daily labour. They do not have wheeled vehicles. They do not have written plans, measurements recorded in ledgers, or architects whose names survive. If leadership exists, it leaves no royal portrait, no throne room, no carved genealogy. This absence has often tempted people to imagine secret technologies or vanished master civilizations. But such ideas are not needed and are not supported by the evidence. The more unsettling possibility is also the more human one. Ordinary prehistoric communities, working with extraordinary commitment, may have been capable of far more than later ages assumed. Their strength lies not in machines, but in coordination. A massive stone pillar does not move because one person dreams of it. It moves because many people accept the dream, or the obligation, or the fear, or the promise bound up with it. Someone knows where to cut. Someone understands the angle of a groove. Someone brings water, food, fibre ropes, wooden levers, stone hammers, and replacement tools. Someone organises bodies around a task. Someone remembers how the last attempt failed. Others watch, learn, and carry the method forward. It may not be a state, but it is society. It may not be government in the later sense, but it is order enough to make stone obey. The social world behind the temple may have been temporary and intense. People could have travelled from different settlements or seasonal camps to gather at the ridge, bringing not only labour but stories, food, ornaments, stone tools, and perhaps rival claims to prestige. The building of the temple may have been inseparable from feasting. Animal bones found in and around such sites suggest a large-scale consumption, especially of wild game. And though the details vary and scholars still debate how to read the deposits, the broader picture is powerful. Work and eating may have belonged together. A community that asks people to cut and haul stone must also feed them. A feast turns labour into memory. It rewards effort, displays generosity, strengthens alliances, and leaves behind heaps of bone that archaeology can still notice thousands of years later. There is a surprising kind of sophistication in this world, because it does not look like the sophistication later people expected. It is not built from writing or royal tombs. It is built from shared practice. The makers of the temple understand stone well enough to shape pillars into tall, stylized forms. Some of these pillars seem almost human without becoming statues in the usual sense. Their broad tops and narrow shafts suggest bodies reduced to abstract power on certain examples. Carved arms appear along the sides, hands resting near a belt, as if the pillar itself stands like a silent being. This is not casual masonry. It is a symbolic architecture in which stone may represent presence. What kind of presence remains uncertain? Ancestors, spirits, mythic figures, guardians, powerful beings, or a category that does not fit modern labels at all. The record does not say, but the intention feels deliberate. The builders also know how to create space. A circle of pillars is not only a collection of stones, it changes how people stand, move, see, and gather. A person entering such an enclosure would be surrounded by upright forms, animal carvings, stone benches, and the open sky above. The arrangement focuses attention. It separates inside from outside without requiring a roof. It turns the ridge into a stage for acts that are now lost. There may have been chanting, procession, offerings, silence, eating, teaching, initiation, mourning, or seasonal renewal. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and the evidence does not permit a simple reconstruction. Still, the architecture itself tells us that experience mattered. The builders were not only making something to be seen from afar, they were making a place to be entered. The absence of cities also changes how we imagine power. Later monuments often show inequality plainly. A ruler commands, workers obey. The monument glorifies a dynasty. Here, power is harder to locate. Perhaps certain ritual specialists guided the work. Perhaps respected elders held knowledge of the site. Perhaps competitive groups contributed pillars to prove strength or devotion. Perhaps no single authority dominated for long. And the temple grew through repeated gatherings across generations. Scholars still debate whether such monuments reveal emerging hierarchy or a different kind of collective organization. What survives in the record suggests complexity, but not yet the clear administrative world of kings. It is a society becoming more tightly woven without leaving the labels that later history depends on. This makes the builders feel both distant and strangely close. They are not anonymous because they are simple. They are anonymous because they lived before the systems that preserve names. No scribe writes down the person who first saw a pillar inside the limestone bedrock. No record tells who carved the fox, who shaped the arms, who decided the enclosure should face a certain way, or who stood there when the stone finally lifted upright. Their individuality is lost, but their choices remain. Each cut in the limestone is a trace of intention. Each tool mark is a small survival of a hand. Each buried enclosure is evidence that human beings, even before agriculture fully changes the world, can gather around invisible meanings and turn them into architecture. The temple, then, is not a miracle dropped into prehistory. It is a challenge to the assumptions brought to prehistory. It asks us to imagine builders without cities, ambition without kings, sacred architecture without writing, and social force without bureaucracy. These people stand at a dangerous and creative edge in the human story, where the old mobile world has not disappeared and the settled farming world has not yet fully arrived. From that edge, they raise stones that will outlast their camps, their voices, their fires, and their names. They build not because civilization, as later ages define it, already exists, but perhaps because something like civilization is beginning to gather around the act of building itself. The first act of building begins not with a pillar standing upright, but with a shape imagined inside the living bedrock. Before any stone can become sacred, it must be separated from the earth that holds it. On the limestone ridge, the builders find surfaces broad enough and firm enough to work. They do not arrive with iron picks or bronze chisels. They carry tools made from harder stone, from flint and other materials capable of cutting, pecking, scraping, and bruising the limestone into obedience. The work is slow, repetitive, and physically punishing. A groove must be cut around the intended pillar. The stone must be outlined, freed along its sides, thinned beneath, and finally detached without breaking the form that so much labour has already created. One wrong fracture can turn days or weeks of effort into useless rubble. The ridge itself becomes both quarry and workshop, a place where architecture is first hidden in the ground before it is raised above it. It is easy to underestimate this stage because the finished monument draws the eye. Upright pillars feel dramatic, carved animals feel mysterious, circular enclosures feel deliberate and strange. But the quarry is where the builder's practical intelligence is most exposed. They must understand the grain and weakness of limestone. They must choose a block large enough to matter, but not so flawed that it fails. They must leave enough thickness in the pillar for strength, while shaping it with the recognizable T-like form that gives the site its haunting identity. Some unfinished stones found in the wider area suggest the process was not always completed. A pillar abandoned before removal can be more revealing than a finished one, because it freezes the work at the moment where ambition meets resistance. The evidence remains incomplete. But these unfinished traces allow archaeologists to glimpse decisions usually erased by success. Once a pillar is detached, the harder problem begins. A stone weighing several tons does not simply travel because people wish it to travel. It must be shifted from quarry to enclosure across ground that is uneven, dusty, and exposed. Without draft animals, carts, metal chains, or modern lifting devices, the builders rely on what they have: many hands, ropes made from plant fibre or hide, wooden beams, levers, rollers perhaps, sledges perhaps, packed paths perhaps, and a deep familiarity with force. Scholars still debate the exact methods used, because wood, rope, and other organic tools rarely survive in such ancient contexts. Yet the absence of surviving ropes does not mean ropes were absent, just as the absence of written instructions does not mean the work lacked planning. The most reasonable picture is not of mystery machines, but of repeated practical experiments carried out by people who learned what the stone would tolerate. The movement of a pillar would have been a social event as much as a technical one. It required timing, command, rhythm, and trust. A group pulling in different directions wastes strength and courts disaster. A stone that slides unexpectedly can crush a foot, break a limb, or kill. Someone must watch the tilt. Someone must keep tension in the rope. Someone must reset the supports. Someone must decide when to pause. The work likely produces a strange mixture of exhaustion and ceremony. Because in a world where labour is never separate from meaning, hauling a sacred stone may itself be part of the act that makes the stone powerful. The builders are not merely transporting material. They are moving a future presence from the body of the hill into the space of gathering. Raising the pillar upright demands another layer of skill. The builders must prepare a socket or setting place, possibly using pits, stone packing, and controlled angles. The pillar may be tilted upward with ropes and levers, its base guided into position while workers stabilize it from different sides. Earth ramps or packed fill could have helped control the lift. Wooden frames may have been used, though direct evidence is difficult to preserve. What survives in the record suggests a methodical process, not a reckless one. The pillars stand because their makers understand balance. They know that an upright stone is not secure merely because it has reached the vertical. Its base must be held, its weight must be distributed, and the surrounding architecture must help keep it in place. The largest pillars change the scale of human presence on the ridge. A person standing beside them would feel not only their height, but their mass. Their surfaces are not natural cliff faces. They are shaped planes, made by hands, disciplined into form. Some are set in pairs at the centre of an enclosure, larger and more commanding than those around them. This pairing gives the space a powerful focus. The arrangement suggests that the builders are thinking not only in terms of construction, but in terms of encounter. A visitor does not simply see stones. A visitor stands before forms that seem almost watchful, almost bodily, almost aware. No single explanation fully accounts for this effect, but the architecture is clearly designed to create it. There is also an important restraint in the engineering. The builders do not attempt everything stone could possibly do. They do not create tall towers, vaulted roofs, or walls climbing high above the ground. Their genius lies in a different direction. They transform the ridge into a sequence of bounded spaces where upright forms, low walls, benches, and the sky work together. This choice may reflect technical limits, but it may also reflect intention. An open enclosure allows light, weather, smoke, and sound to move through it. The sky remains part of the sanctuary. The horizon remains visible or remembered just beyond the ring. The place is built, but it is not sealed off from the living world. Surprisingly, much of the labour may have been done with tools that look modest in the hand. A flint tool or stone hammer does not appear impressive beside a finished pillar, yet such tools can reshape limestone through persistence. The difference between a rough outcrop and a monumental form is not always a dramatic invention. Often it is repetition multiplied by purpose. Strike after strike, scrape after scrape, groove after groove, the stone changes. This is a form of patience almost alien to modern impatience. The builders do not need speed in the modern sense. They need enough food, enough people, enough belief, and enough continuity for the work to survive from one day to the next. The stones raised from the earth therefore reveal two mysteries at once. One is technical. How exactly did people without metal tools and draft animals quarry, move, and erect such pillars? The other is deeper. What force of meaning made the effort worthwhile? The first mystery can be narrowed by archaeology, experiment, and comparison. The second can only be approached through the stones themselves and the world around them. What is certain is that the builders are not passive people waiting for civilization to begin. They are already making large claims upon the landscape. They cut the hill open, draw forms out of it, drag those forms into prepared spaces, and stand them upright beneath the sky. In doing so, they turn limestone into memory before history has even learned to write. When the pillars stand, they are not left mute. Their surfaces become a second landscape, one made not of grass, dust, and moving animals, but of images fixed in stone. The carvings do not cover every surface equally, and they do not explain themselves in any simple way. They appear suddenly out of the limestone foxes with narrow bodies, snakes sliding in lines, birds with long necks, wild boar, scorpions, aurochs, spiders or insect-like forms, and other creatures whose exact identity is sometimes debated. Some are carved in low relief, raised just enough to catch the changing light. Others feel sharper, more emphatic, as if the animal has been pressed out of the stone by a memory too important to leave invisible. The builders who shaped the pillars also chose to give them a living skin. The first mistake is to treat these animals as decoration in the modern sense. They are not ornaments added to make a wall more pleasant. Many of the creatures are dangerous, elusive, night-moving, or difficult to control. A scorpion is not a source of comfort. A snake is not a simple emblem of beauty. A wild boar can injure a hunter badly. A fox moves between visibility and disappearance with unsettling ease. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of cattle, is powerful enough to make later domestic cattle seem almost diminished by comparison. These are not the harmless animals of a peaceful farmyard. They belong to a world in which humans share the land with beings that can feed them, frighten them, poison them, challenge them, or appear and vanish at the edge of firelight. What survives in the record suggests that the carvings were made with skill and intention. The lines are not random scratches. The bodies of the animals are often reduced to clear, readable forms, with the essential features emphasized. A fox must read as a fox. A snake must move like a snake even when locked in stone. Some animals seem to travel across the pillar surface, while others hold a fixed position as if marking a boundary. The artists understand both observation and abstraction. They are not copying nature in the later realistic sense. They are selecting from nature, sharpening its signs, turning living creatures into symbols whose meanings now remain partly beyond reach. The most haunting images are not always the most dramatic. A line of small snakes can feel more disturbing than a larger beast because it suggests number, motion, and hiddenness. A scorpion placed on stone carries the memory of pain and danger in a tiny form. Birds may refer to carrion, sky, wetlands, migration, or something entirely different. Scholars still debate whether certain long-necked birds represent cranes, vultures, or other species. And the identification matters because each animal could have carried different associations. Vultures, for example, appear in later symbolic worlds connected with death and the treatment of bodies, but applying later meanings too confidently to this much earlier site is risky. The evidence remains incomplete, and the carvings resist being folded neatly into one code. There are also images that seem almost human, though not in the familiar way. Some central pillars carry carved arms along their sides, with hands meeting near the front, sometimes above a belt or loincloth-like feature. The pillar is still a pillar, still abstract, still a T-shaped mass of limestone, yet it becomes bodily. It suggests a figure without a carved face, a presence without eyes. This is one of the deepest puzzles of the sanctuary. If these pillars represent beings, they are not represented as ordinary humans. Their heads may be implied by the broad upper form, but faces are absent. Their bodies are reduced to arms, hands, clothing, and posture. No single explanation fully accounts for this. They may be ancestors, supernatural beings, powerful persons, or something outside categories inherited from later religion. The contrast between the faceless pillars and the vivid animals is striking. The animals are specific, active, and recognizable. The central beings, if beings they are silent and withheld. This may not be accidental. The builders may have lived in a symbolic world where human-like power did not need a face, while animal forces demanded visible form. Or perhaps the pillars are not human figures at all in the way modern viewers assume. Archaeology often warns against easy recognition. A shape that looks familiar may not have meant what it seems to mean. Yet the carved arms and hands are difficult to ignore. They make the stone feel embodied, and once that possibility enters the mind, the enclosure changes. The visitor is no longer standing among objects. The visitor may be standing among presences. Some popular interpretations have tried to turn the carvings into star maps, warnings of comets, records of catastrophes, or encrypted messages from a lost advanced civilization. Such ideas can be dramatic, and a few may begin from genuine curiosity about ancient symbols, but most go far beyond what the evidence can safely support. The carvings do not come with a key. They do not form a readable text in the ordinary sense. They are better approached as part of a prehistoric symbolic system rooted in the animals, fears, landscapes, and social worlds of the builders. That does not make them less mysterious. It makes them more difficult, because their mystery belongs to real human lives rather than to a convenient modern fantasy. The lesser-known detail is that absence matters as much as presence. Many later sacred places display gods, rulers, weapons, scenes of conquest, or agricultural abundance. Here, there is no clear king, no ploughed field, no army, no written prayer. The imagery leans toward wildness, even if some nearby communities are beginning to experiment with more settled life. The carved world of the temple is still filled with untamed creatures. That choice may preserve the mental landscape of people living at the edge of a great transformation. Farming will eventually reshape the relationship between humans and animals, turning some species into property, labor, meat, and herd. But on these stones, animals still appear as independent powers. The carving process itself would have changed the builder's relationship to the stone. A blank pillar is impressive, but a carved pillar remembers touch. Someone must decide where the animal belongs. Someone must rough out the outline, cut away the surrounding surface, refine the body, sharpen the legs, shape the head, and trust that the form will emerge without error. The act requires close attention to both the material and the image held in the mind. In a world without written theology, making the image may itself be a way of preserving knowledge. Stone becomes a kind of memory system, not writing, but not silence either. The carvings in the dust therefore stand between evidence and enigma. They tell us the builders watched animals carefully, feared or revered certain creatures, shaped stone with confidence, and filled their enclosures with symbolic force. They do not tell us exactly what stories were spoken there, what gestures accompanied the images, or what emotions passed through those who stood before them. That missing part is not a failure of archaeology. It is the depth of time doing what deep time does. It leaves the durable things and takes the voice, so the animals remain, moving without motion across limestone, carrying meanings that can be approached, compared, debated, and partly understood, but never fully possessed. Under the hill, the temple is not only built from stones, it is built from signs left by minds whose world is gone, but not entirely silent. Around the circles, the stones make silence feel organized. A person entering one of these enclosures does not step into a house, a storehouse, or a defensive shelter. The space does not seem designed for sleeping, grinding grain, keeping animals, or hiding from weather. It gathers attention toward the upright pillars, toward the carved creatures, toward the central pair that stand with a strange, faceless authority. The low walls and stone benches hold the visitor inside a boundary without fully closing the sky. Light passes over the carved surfaces. Wind moves through the opening. Dust settles in the corners. The place is architectural, but it is also exposed to the world beyond it, as if the builders wanted a separation from ordinary life without cutting the sanctuary away from earth, air, and horizon. What happened inside these circles remains one of the deepest uncertainties. There is no written ritual manual, no painted procession, no priestly archive, no list of offerings. The evidence remains incomplete, and any reconstruction must be careful, yet the stones themselves, the deposits around them, and the wider pattern of the site suggest repeated gatherings rather than a single brief event. People return here, they build, modify, use, fill, and sometimes rebuild. They bring animals, tools, food, and perhaps stories carried from distant camps. The sanctuary is not a moment frozen by accident. It is a place in use across time, shaped by repeated acts whose exact words and gestures have disappeared. One of the strongest clues comes from feasting. Archaeologists have found large quantities of animal bones at and around such monumental gathering places, especially from wild species. The bones do not simply tell us that people ate. Everyone eats. What matters is scale, concentration, and context. Large amounts of wild game suggest events where many people may have been fed. Perhaps after hunts organized round seasonal movement, perhaps during rituals tied to building or renewal. Gazelle bones, wild cattle, wild boar, birds, and other remains speak of a food world still rooted in hunting rather than domestic herds. A feast at the ridge would not be a casual meal. It would be a social engine. Food draws people together, rewards labor, displays generosity, strengthens alliances, and turns a difficult project into a remembered occasion. The atmosphere of such gatherings is difficult to recover, but not impossible to imagine in broad outline. People may arrive in small groups from different directions, climbing the ridge after journeys measured not by maps but by water sources, familiar stones, and inherited paths. Some bring meat, others bring worked flint, hides, ornaments, baskets, wood, plant foods, or knowledge needed for the work. Fires burn near the enclosures. Smoke drifts across the limestone. Bodies crowd around tasks that require many hands. Someone cuts, someone hauls, someone prepares food, someone watches the sky or the animals or the behavior of the gathered people. Children may have seen the stones from outside or at a distance, though we cannot know who was allowed into the most charged spaces. The place may have had rules, and those rules are lost. Ritual does not have to mean a calm ceremony separated from ordinary labour. In prehistoric life, the sacred and practical may have been deeply entangled. The act of quarrying a pillar could itself be ritual. Dragging it might be ritual. Raising it upright might be the central drama of a gathering, an event remembered for years. Feasting afterward might renew bonds between groups who otherwise lived apart. The animals carved on the stones might refer to stories told during these gatherings, to dangers overcome, to powers invoked, or to identities claimed. Scholars still debate whether the enclosures were temples in the strict sense, communal houses, mortuary spaces, initiation places, feasting centres, or something for which modern categories are too narrow. The word temple is useful, but it may also be too simple. A lesser-known possibility concerns sound. Open stone enclosures can shape the way voices, drums, footsteps, and movement feel within a bounded space. No direct evidence preserves the soundscape, but the arrangement invites attention to performance. A chant, a low repeated rhythm, the scrape of stone tools, the crackle of fire, the murmur of a crowd, the sudden silence before a pillar rises. These are not decorative details. They are part of how a place becomes powerful. A carved fox seen in bright noon light is one thing. The same fox glimpsed by firelight while people gather around fresh blood, cooked meat, smoke, and stone is another. Meaning lives not only in objects, but in events. Mortuary practices may also hover near the edges of the mystery. In parts of the broader region, early communities sometimes treated skulls and human remains in ways that suggest complex relationships with the dead. At some sites, skulls were removed, modified, kept, buried, or displayed. Whether the buried temple's main enclosures were directly tied to ancestor rituals or death rites remains debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. Yet the faceless human-like pillars, the dangerous animals, and the charged architecture make it reasonable to suspect that the builders were not simply celebrating abundance. They may have been negotiating with death, memory, identity, and powers believed to stand beyond ordinary human control. The wild animals strengthen that impression, a ritual space filled with foxes, snakes, scorpions, boar, and great cattle does not feel like a peaceful harvest shrine. It feels alert, tense, watchful. The creatures may have represented threats, protectors, clan signs, mythic episodes, or the untamed forces surrounding human life. Their presence suggests that the people gathered here were not imagining themselves as masters of nature in the later agricultural sense. They stood among animals that could still define the limits of human confidence. To carve such beings into stone may have been a way to summon, contain, honour, or confront them. The exact meaning is gone, but the emotional field remains sharp. At the centre of all this are the people themselves, not as a crowd of anonymous labourers, but as communities learning how to become larger than their separate lives. Ritual around the circles may have created trust between groups, arranged marriages, settled disputes, marked seasons, remembered the dead, initiated the young, or justified claims to certain places. It may also have produced inequality, allowing certain individuals to gain influence by controlling knowledge, food, timing, or access. What survives in the record suggests that these gatherings were not trivial. They required effort and created consequences. Once people have built together, eaten together, remembered together, and returned to the same charged place, they are no longer connected only by immediate need. They are connected by a shared past. The circles therefore are not silent because nothing happened there. They are silent because almost everything that happened there was made of voice, movement, smell, food, fear, heat, and belief, and those things rarely survive for 11,000 years. Stone survives, bone survives, tool fragments survive, burned traces survive. The rest must be approached with caution and imagination held tightly to evidence. Still, the enclosures make one point difficult to avoid. The people who gathered at the buried temple were not merely building objects. They were building experiences powerful enough to bring them back, powerful enough to organize labor, powerful enough to fill the hill with memory. Around the circles, the first architecture of stone becomes an architecture of human attention, and in that attention, something like a new social world begins to take shape. The buried temple unsettles the usual order of the human story because it stands at the edge of farming, not comfortably after it. For a long time, the simplest explanation for monuments seems obvious. People learn to cultivate plants, produce extra food, settle in one place, and only then gain the time and organization needed to build sacred architecture. In that version, farming is the engine and temples are the result. But the stones on the ridge complicate that neat sequence. They appear in a world where wild foods still matter deeply, where hunted animals dominate much of the evidence, and where domesticated life has not yet fully taken command. The sanctuary seems to rise before farming becomes the unquestioned center of society. That does not overturn everything scholars know, but it changes the rhythm. It suggests that belief, gathering, ritual obligation, and shared labor may have helped create the conditions that made farming more necessary. Not merely followed after farming had already solved the problem of food. To understand why this matters, one has to imagine the practical pressure created by a sacred place that succeeds. A small gathering can be fed by ordinary hunting and foraging if timing is favorable. A large gathering is different. If people come from several groups, if they stay for days or weeks, if they work on stone, feast, perform rites, and return again over generations, the demand for predictable food grows. Wild gazelle herds can be hunted, but they cannot be summoned at will. Nuts, fruits, and wild grains ripen in seasons, not according to a ritual calendar. A community may know the land with extraordinary skill and still face the problem of feeding many bodies at once. A sacred center that pulls people together becomes a place where abundance must be organized. This does not mean the builders instantly invent farming because they want a temple. Human change is rarely so simple. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the long transition from foraging to agriculture. Climate matters. Population matters. Local plant ecology matters. Social pressure matters. Experimentation matters. But the temple introduces a powerful possibility. Communal ritual may have increased the value of staying near certain places, managing nearby food resources, encouraging wild grain growth, storing supplies, and eventually cultivating plants more deliberately. What begins as gathering for ceremony may slowly reshape the everyday economy around it. In the wider region, the raw materials of agriculture are already present. Wild einkorn wheat, wild barley, legumes, and other useful plants grow across parts of the Fertile Crescent. People have been gathering, processing, and eating such foods long before full domestication. Grinding stones, storage features, and plant remains from various early sites show that humans understand seeds, seasons, and harvests with great precision. The difference between collecting wild grain and cultivating domesticated grain is not a single bright line crossed in one inspired moment. It is a long relationship. People return to good stands, harvest them, disturb the soil, discard seeds, perhaps protect patches, perhaps favor plants with useful traits without intending to transform a species. Over time, human behavior begins to alter the plants, and the plants begin to alter human life. The temple belongs to this slow turning. Its builders may still eat mostly wild foods, but their gathering habits may push them toward greater control of food sources. A feast after raising a pillar requires meat. Yes, but also plant foods that can be carried, stored, prepared, and shared. Wild cereals are especially useful because they can be gathered in quantity and kept for later use if protected from moisture and pests. Once people begin to rely on stored food for social events, storage itself gains importance. Once storage gains importance, staying near storage or defending it becomes more important. Once certain places become central to memory and obligation, moving away from them becomes more costly. The temple does not have to cause farming by itself. It may simply make settled life more attractive, more practical, or more socially necessary. There is a striking irony in this. The carved world of the sanctuary is filled with wild animals. It does not celebrate neat fields or obedient herds. It seems to look backward, or perhaps outward, toward a landscape still alive with dangerous independence. Yet the social world that gathers around those wild images may help produce the opposite future villages, fields, domesticated animals, inherited property, and eventually the hierarchies that monuments are often assumed to require. The ridge may preserve a moment when humans are still emotionally and symbolically bound to the wild, even as their own gatherings begin to pull them toward domestication. Scholars still debate how conscious this shift was. The builders almost certainly did not imagine themselves beginning a revolution that would change the planet. They were answering immediate needs, honoring meanings they understood, and feeding people who came to a place that mattered. The lesser-known detail is that early domestication is not simply a story of human cleverness conquering nature. It is also a story of narrowing choices. Farming can provide more predictable food, but it also ties people to labor, seasons, fields, storage, and vulnerability to crop failure. It may increase population while making people dependent on fewer foods. It may support larger communities while creating new forms of disease, conflict, and inequality. From a distance, agriculture looks like progress because later civilization depends on it. From within the transition, it may feel less like a triumph and more like a tightening web. A sacred center that requires repeated provisioning could be one strand in that web. This possibility gives the temple a strange place in human history. It may not be a monument built by farmers after agriculture has made society complex. It may be part of the very process by which society becomes complex enough to need farming. The direction of cause and effect becomes tangled. People gather because the place is sacred. The gathering demands food. Food demands planning. Planning encourages settlement. Settlement changes social relations. New social relations make larger rituals possible. Larger rituals demand still more food. Around and around the pattern turns, until the world that built the sanctuary is no longer the same world that began it. None of this removes uncertainty. The site alone cannot explain the entire Neolithic transformation, and it would be misleading to pretend that one temple gives birth to agriculture everywhere. Farming emerges through many local developments across a broad region, with different plants, climates, communities, and histories. But the buried sanctuary forces a more subtle question. Human beings may not have settled down only because they discovered a better way to eat. They may also have settled because they needed to gather, remember, compete, mourn, celebrate, and stand before stones that made the world feel ordered. Bread may feed the body, but ritual can organize the labor that makes bread necessary. So the temple before farming is not an anomaly to be pushed aside. It is a clue to a deeper transformation. It shows people at the moment when the sacred, the social, and the economic begin to braid together. The ridge calls them back. The stones demand hands. The gatherings demand food. The food demands new habits. And slowly, beneath the open sky and among carvings of untamed animals, the future field begins to take shape before anyone has a word for civilization. The world that gathers around the temple is not still. Even stone, which appears to resist time, rises in an age of motion. The last ice age has loosened its grip, but the release is not smooth or gentle. Warming comes unevenly. Cold returns in pulses. Rain shifts across the land. Forests advance in some places and retreat in others. Herds change their paths as the vegetation changes beneath them. Human groups that once depended on older patterns must adjust to a world that seems familiar in outline but unstable in detail. The ridge, the animals, the wild grains, the seasonal waters, and the gatherings around the pillars all belong to this turning climate, where the ancient rules of survival are being rewritten slowly enough to be lived through, but quickly enough to matter. In deep prehistory, climate is never merely background. It decides where plants grow, where animals move, how many people a landscape can support, and how far a group must travel to survive a difficult season. A small change in rainfall can alter the value of a valley. A warming trend can open new plant zones while drying others. A cold snap can scatter animals that people expected to find. The builders of the temple do not measure these changes with instruments, but they feel them in the body. They know when certain grasses ripen earlier or later. They know when a water source becomes unreliable. They know when gazelle herds arrive in thinner numbers. They know when familiar routes require adjustment. Their climate record is stored in memory, hunger, movement, and story. The period after the Ice Age is often imagined as a simple awakening, as if the world warms and human life automatically becomes easier. The reality is more complicated. Warming can create abundance, but it can also create uncertainty. A richer landscape may support more people, and more people may place greater pressure on resources. Plants that thrive for generations may fail during abrupt dry phases. Groups that once spread widely may find themselves drawn toward more dependable zones. Increasing contact, cooperation, and conflict. What survives in the record suggests not one sudden crisis, but a long sequence of adjustments. People experiment with settlement, storage, wild grain harvesting, new ritual centers, and new ways of holding communities together because the old balance between movement and place is changing. One climatic episode often discussed in relation to this transformation is the Younger Dryas, a return to colder and drier conditions that interrupts the broader warming trend near the end of the Pleistocene. Its impact varies by region, and scholars still debate the exact connections between this climatic reversal and the emergence of new social forms in Southwest Asia. It would be too simple to say that a cold event creates temples or farming directly. No single explanation fully accounts for such changes. Yet abrupt climate stress may have pushed communities to intensify their use of reliable resources, gather in favored areas, and develop stronger social mechanisms for survival. When conditions become uncertain, a place that organizes people can become as important as a place that feeds them. After the Younger Dryas, the Holocene brings warmer conditions, and with them new possibilities. Wild cereals expand in some areas. Woodland and grassland mosaics shift. Animals adapt, and humans adapt with them. The landscape around the temple's world becomes a theatre of opportunity. But opportunity does not remove danger. Instead, it invites new commitments. If a certain zone provides grain, game, stone, water, and a powerful gathering place, people may return more often and stay longer. Over generations, such return can become tradition. Tradition can become obligation. Obligation can become architecture. The climate does not carve the pillars, but it helps shape the human decisions that make pillars possible. There is something almost poetic in the fact that the temple stones stand during a time when the living world refuses to stand still. The builders choose permanence in an age of transition. They raise upright forms from limestone while plants, animals, seasons, and human habits are shifting around them. This may be one reason the sanctuary feels so charged. It is not merely a monument to belief, it is a monument to stability created under conditions of change, to return to the same ridge, to stand before the same pillars, to carve the same dangerous animals into stone, may have offered a way of making the world feel legible when the world itself was moving. The animal carvings take on a deeper meaning in this climate story. Wild creatures are not just symbolic figures, they are also indicators of ecological change. Herd animals respond to grasslands, boar respond to woodland and wet ground. Birds follow water and season. Snakes, foxes, scorpions, and other creatures occupy the warmer margins of human awareness, appearing and disappearing as conditions allow. The builders live inside a web of species whose movements reveal the state of the land. When they carve animals, they may be carving more than myth or danger. They may also be fixing into stone a world of ecological relationships at the moment before domestication begins to reorder them. A lesser-known consequence of climate change is that it can compress human worlds. When resources concentrate in reliable pockets, people who once ranged more widely may encounter one another more often. Repeated contact can create exchange, marriage alliances, shared rituals, and common projects. But it can also create rivalry. A monumental sanctuary may help manage that pressure. It gives scattered groups a central place to gather under shared rules. It can turn potential competition into cooperation, at least for a time. Building together may reduce tension, or it may display status in controlled ways. Feasting may redistribute food, but also advertise who can provide it. The temple could be a response not only to environmental change, but to the social density that environmental change helps produce. The rise of such a place also changes how people think about the future. Mobile foragers often plan with great sophistication, but monumental building requires another kind of planning. A pillar is not cut for a single night's use. An enclosure is not created for one meal and forgotten. The effort assumes return. It assumes that people will come back, that the place will continue to matter, that memory can be anchored to stone. In a changing climate, this is a bold act. It says, in effect, that whatever else shifts, this ridge will remain a point of return. The evidence remains incomplete, but the architecture itself carries that promise. The turning climate, therefore, does not explain the temple in a mechanical way. It does not whisper instructions into human ears or force anyone to carve a fox into limestone, but it creates the pressures and possibilities in which such decisions become meaningful. Warming opens new resources. Dry phases sharpen uncertainty. Growing populations increase the need for social bonds. Wild grains become more important. Herds remain essential but less predictable. People gather, feast, remember, compete, and experiment with staying closer to places that hold both food and meaning. Out of that restless world, the buried temple rises as a human answer to instability. And beneath the later mound, the stones preserve that answer long after the climate has turned again. They hold the memory of a moment when people stand between the Ice Age and the farming world, between old mobility and new settlement, between animals that cannot be controlled and plants that soon will be. The sanctuary belongs to the threshold. Its pillars are not just stone forms in a circle. They are markers of a species learning to face change by making places that endure. The strangest decision in the story may not be the raising of the stones, but their burial. A temple can fall into ruin through neglect. A wall can collapse after rain, frost, earthquake, or simple age. later people can rob stones for other buildings, leaving only foundations and scattered blocks. But here, much of the sacred architecture appears to have been deliberately covered. The enclosures are not merely abandoned to open air. They are filled with earth, broken stone, flint debris, animal bone, and rubble until the upright pillars disappear inside a growing mound. The place that once gathered people beneath the sky is slowly turned inward, sealed inside the hill it helped create. This act gives the sanctuary one of its deepest mysteries, because building a sacred place requires effort, but burying it carefully requires effort too. To imagine the burial, one must slow the scene down. The enclosures do not vanish in a single dramatic moment like a city swallowed by fire. The filling seems to occur through repeated actions, perhaps over different phases, perhaps after certain structures have completed their use. People bring material into the spaces, they pack it around the pillars, they cover carved animals that had once been visible, they reduce open ritual space into a mass of hidden architecture. Dust and debris accumulate not as accidental trash alone, but as part of a transformation. What had been entered becomes inaccessible. What had faced the living becomes enclosed among the dead materials of feasts, tools, quarry waste, and earth. Why would people do this? Scholars still debate the question because the evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. One possibility is ritual closure. Sacred places are not always meant to remain open forever. In many human societies, powerful objects or spaces can require formal ending. A sanctuary may be sealed when its purpose is fulfilled, when a generation passes, when a dangerous force must be contained, or when a new phase of ritual life replaces an old one. Burying the enclosures could have been an act of respect rather than destruction. The builders may have believed they were returning the stones to the earth, protecting them, retiring them, or closing a relationship that could not simply be left to decay. Another possibility is transformation through rebuilding. The site may not have been a single temple used unchanged and then abandoned. It may have grown through phases, with older enclosures filled in as newer ones were built nearby or above. In this view, burial is part of architectural renewal. A sacred place can remain sacred precisely because it is remade. Older structures become foundations, memories beneath the feet of later visitors. The hill grows as generations add, cover, modify, and shift the focus of activity. The temple becomes less like one building and more like a landscape of accumulated ritual acts. The mound itself becomes a monument, not by accident, but by the repeated covering of what came before. There may also have been practical reasons mixed with sacred ones. Stone enclosures exposed to weather require maintenance. Pillars may lean, walls may crack. Social groups may move, merge, or lose the ability to support such labor. The world around the temple is changing, and as communities become more settled in different ways, their ritual needs may change as well. What once drew people to a high ridge may later feel less central than village shrines, houses, storage places, or new forms of community life. The burial could mark a shift in social gravity. People do not necessarily reject the old sanctuary. They may simply stop needing it in the same way, and when its time ends, they close it according to rules we can no longer hear. The contents of the fill complicate the picture. It is not clean soil alone. It includes material from daily and ritual life bones, stone tools, debris, fragments, and sediments. Such fill may have been gathered from nearby activity areas, perhaps from feasting and working zones around the enclosures. If so, the burial does not merely hide the temple, it packs the memory of its use back into it. The remains of animals eaten during gatherings, the broken tools of builders, the chips struck from stone, the discarded fragments of human action all become part of the ceiling. The sanctuary is buried with traces of the very life it organized. That detail is easy to miss, but it is powerful. The fill is not empty. It is dense with human presence. Some have imagined catastrophe and invasion, a plague, a sudden fear, a cosmic disaster, a violent ending that forced people to cover the site quickly. Such ideas are tempting because they give the story a dramatic final blow. Yet dramatic explanations often outrun the evidence. There is no need to invent a lost war or apocalyptic panic to explain the burial, unless the archaeological record demands it, and here the record is more subtle. The act of filling appears organized, not simply frantic. This does not mean conflict or crisis played no role. Prehistoric communities surely faced violence, scarcity, and fear. But the buried temple should not be treated as proof of a sensational collapse when a slower ritual or social transformation fits the evidence more carefully. The emotional meaning of burial is difficult to grasp from a modern distance. Today, uncovering the temple feels like rescue. To modern eyes, hiding carved pillars beneath tons of debris can seem almost tragic, as if beauty were being destroyed. But ancient people may not have seen burial as erasure. In many symbolic worlds, covering something can preserve its power, protect it from misuse, or move it from the realm of the living into another kind of presence. A buried object can become more sacred, not less. A closed place can remain active in memory. The act of concealment may have been a way of making the sanctuary permanent. Ironically, if they had left the pillars exposed, weather and later stone robbers might have destroyed far more. By hiding the temple, they gave it to the future without intending to. There is also a human sadness in the possibility that meanings changed. The wild animal world carved on the stones may have belonged to communities still deeply tied to hunting and seasonal gathering. As farming spreads and village life becomes more established, new concerns rise: fields, houses, storage, herds, inheritance, domestic ancestors, household rituals, and the daily discipline of planted land. The old ridge sanctuary may have seemed tied to an earlier order of life. Its burial could mark the fading of a worldview in which dangerous wild beings dominated sacred imagination. What survives in the record suggests not a clean break, but a long transition. Still, transitions often leave old sacred places behind, even when they are closed with care. The burial of the temple, therefore, is not simply an ending. It is another act of construction. The builders, or their descendants, reshape open space into hidden mass. They turn visible symbols into buried memory. They create the mound that later generations will mistake for an ordinary hill. The sanctuary's disappearance is part of its survival. Its silence is made by hands. Its darkness is chosen, or at least accepted, long before archaeology brings light back into the chambers of stone. Beneath the accumulating earth, the foxes, snakes, boar, scorpions, birds, and faceless pillars wait without weather, without worshippers, without explanation. Above them, life moves on. The ridge changes, the old paths fade, the sacred place becomes landscape, and the landscape learns to keep the secret. Once the sanctuary is sealed, time begins its quietest work. The ridge no longer announces itself as a place of carved pillars and gathered crowds. The open circles have become packed earth. The central stones stand in darkness. The animals carved into limestone no longer catch sunlight or firelight. No hands pass over their edges. No one steps between the pillars with the same intentions that once gave the place its force. Above them, the mound settles. Rain presses the fill more tightly into the enclosures. Wind brings dust. Plants root in the surface. Small animals burrow and vanish. The temple does not collapse into oblivion in a single moment. It enters a different kind of existence, one measured not by ceremony, but by layers. The silence beneath the hill is not empty. It is full of pressure, minerals, moisture, roots, and the slow chemistry of burial. bone changes, organic matter decays, stone tools remain, limestone weathers differently underground than it would in the open air. Some carvings are protected by the very soil that hides them, while others suffer from cracks, compression, or ancient damage already present before burial. The record that survives to the modern world is not a perfect frozen room. It is a filtered survival. What archaeology eventually finds is shaped by what ancient people did, what time destroyed, what soil preserved, and what excavation is able to recognize. The evidence remains incomplete because silence is never neutral. It keeps some things and takes others. Above ground, human life continues through transformations so large that the buried builders would scarcely recognize them. Farming spreads more firmly across the region, settlements grow, domesticated plants and animals become the foundation of daily existence. Houses cluster together, storage becomes more central. Social obligations shift from seasonal gathering to village life. Fields, herds, and inherited places. Later still, pottery appears more widely. Metallurgy develops. Trade networks expand, and the first towns and cities begin their long rise. The world that once gathered around wild animals carved in stone gives way to a world increasingly organized around controlled landscapes. The ridge remains, but its old meaning fades. This fading may not happen all at once. Memories can linger long after buildings are buried. A hill may remain avoided, honored, feared, or named in stories whose original meaning slowly dissolves. Descendants may know that the place is unusual without knowing why. They may see worked stones on the surface and attach new explanations to them. They may bring animals there, pass by it, camp near it, or ignore it completely. Scholars still debate how long memory of such sites may have survived in local tradition. Deep time makes this difficult to trace. Oral memory can be powerful, but across thousands of years, languages change, populations move, religions transform, and stories detach from their first objects. Eventually, the temple becomes not forgotten in the ordinary sense, but untranslatable. The surrounding landscape changes again and again. Forests alter their extent. Grasslands expand and contract. Villages rise, move, or disappear. New peoples enter the region. Old roots become new roots. The great river systems and uplands that helped shape prehistoric life become part of later worlds of farming, herding, trade, empire, and conquest. Names multiply over the land, then vanish. Boundaries are drawn and redrawn by powers that know nothing of the buried enclosures. Armies may pass within reach of the ridge. Shepherds may lead flocks across the slope. Farmers may work land nearby. The mound remains patient through all of it, carrying a history older than the histories people begin to tell about themselves. There is a strange humility in this long silence. The temple is not like a ruin whose broken walls remind every generation that something grand once stood there. It becomes a hill, and a hill asks for little attention. It does not insist. It does not explain. It allows later human worlds to build their certainties above a much older uncertainty. People may believe civilization begins with their own known ancestors, their own texts, their own kings, their own gods. While beneath a quiet rise lies evidence that human complexity has roots far deeper and stranger than their stories allow. The mound does not argue, it waits. The stones inside the hill also escape many of the usual fates of ancient monuments. They are not widely quarried for later buildings because they are not fully visible. They are not reshaped into thresholds, millstones, or wall blocks on the scale that ruins often suffer. Their carvings are not deliberately erased by later religious reformers who see them as dangerous images. Their faceless forms do not stand exposed to centuries of frost and sun. Concealment becomes a shield. What appears to be disappearance is, over the long term, a form of preservation. No single explanation fully accounts for the survival of any ancient site, but here burial is central. The temple endures because it stops participating in visible history. That endurance, however, comes at a cost. The meanings that might have been carried by continuous use are lost. A living temple can explain itself through repetition. People teach one another where to stand, what to bring, which gestures matter, which stories belong to which stone. Once that chain breaks, the architecture becomes evidence without instruction. The animals still appear, but their names in the builder's language are gone. The central pillars still hold their strange bodily posture. But the beings they may have represented no longer have a living place in human memory. The circles still organize space, but the events that once filled them have evaporated. What survives in the record suggests intensity, not explanation. This is why the silence beneath the hill feels different from simple absence. It is a silence made of interrupted transmission. The builders were not mute. They spoke, sang, argued, taught, remembered, and perhaps feared the place they had made. Their silence exists only from our side of time. To them, the sanctuary may have been crowded with meaning. To us, it is crowded with questions. The gap between those two realities is the space in which archaeology must work. For thousands of years. Then, the buried temple lives as a contradiction. It is present and absent, preserved and lost, protected and cut off from memory. Above it, the human world becomes more complex, more settled, more hierarchical, more literate, more capable of recording itself. And yet this older achievement remains outside the record. The mound grows ordinary. The extraordinary waits underneath. By the time modern eyes begin to suspect that the hill is not natural, the people who built it are separated from the present by an ocean of change farming. Villages, cities, states, empires, religions, languages, wars, and ruins upon ruins. The first sanctuary has become one of the last things anyone expects to find. That is why its rediscovery will feel less like uncovering a building than like reopening a sealed question at the beginning of civilization itself. When modern attention finally returns to the mound, it does not arrive with instant revelation. The hill has spent so long pretending to be ordinary that even trained eyes do not immediately understand what they are seeing. In the 20th century, surveyors moving across the region notice worked stones, flint, and unusual remains on the surface. The place is recorded, but it is not yet recognized as one of the most important prehistoric sanctuaries ever found. Some of the visible stone fragments appear too large, too weathered, too strangely placed. Yet because the hill also carries later traces, and because archaeology often meets the past in confusing mixtures, the first interpretation remains cautious. The mound is interesting, but not yet astonishing. Its greatest structures still lie sealed below, and the surface gives only enough evidence to mislead. This is one of archaeology's quiet ironies. A discovery can exist in plain view for years before the question is asked in the right way. The land does not change, the stones do not move. What changes is the human frame of attention. A fragment that looks like a grave marker to one observer may look like the broken head of a monumental pillar to another. A mound that seems like a later cemetery may begin to look artificial, deliberately built, filled with prehistoric debris. The evidence remains incomplete in the beginning, but the mismatch becomes harder to ignore. Too many flint tools lie scattered across the surface. Too many stone pieces appear worked. The hill seems to contain something older and larger than anyone has yet allowed. The turning point comes when renewed investigation looks at the ridge not as a minor surface scatter, but as a buried prehistoric complex. The name most closely tied to this recognition is Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist whose experience with early Neolithic sites in the region helps him see what others had missed. He walks the mound and recognizes that the large limestone fragments are not ordinary. They resemble the tops of T-shaped pillars, the same strange form that will soon become the signature of the site. He understands that if these pieces are only the exposed tips or broken remains of deeper architecture, then the hill is not a natural hill with a few scattered stones. It may be a mound made by people, full of architecture older than the known cities of Mesopotamia. Excavation begins carefully, because archaeology is not treasure hunting when it is done well. Soil must be removed in layers, finds must be mapped, stone positions must be recorded, every change in fill, every bone fragment, every tool, every surface matters. The goal is not simply to uncover beautiful pillars, but to understand how they came to be there, how they were used, and how they were buried. Slowly, the earth gives way. At first, perhaps, the results still seem almost unbelievable. A stone surface appears, then a wall, then the curve of an enclosure, then a pillar standing upright where no pillar of that age was expected to stand. The mound begins to stop being a hill and starts becoming a question with edges. As more earth is removed, the scale becomes undeniable. The enclosures are not isolated accidents. They form a planned sacred landscape with multiple circular or oval spaces, each built with stone walls and fitted with T-shaped pillars. Some pillars stand around the perimeter, while larger ones occupy central positions. Carvings emerge from the dust foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, arms, hands, belts. The images are not the rough marks of idle hands. They are deliberate, confident, and old beyond expectation. What had been a quiet ridge now reveals itself as a place of repeated construction, use, filling, and renewal. The buried temple is not a small curiosity. It is a monument at the dawn of the Neolithic world. The dates make the discovery even more unsettling. Scientific dating of organic remains associated with the site places its major phases around the 10th millennium before the Common Era, in the period before fully developed farming societies dominate the region. This means the sanctuary is thousands of years older than Stonehenge and far older than the pyramids. Such comparisons can be overused, but here they help convey the shock. The temple belongs to a time when many older narratives would not have expected architecture of this ambition. It does not fit comfortably into the assumption that only settled agricultural states can organize monumental building. The stones force archaeology to widen its imagination without abandoning evidence. There is also a human drama in the excavation itself. The modern archaeologists are not only uncovering objects, they are confronting the limits of their own categories. Is this a temple, a ritual center, a gathering place, a mortuary landscape, or something for which the modern vocabulary is too narrow? Calling it a temple gives the public a useful image, but scholars still debate the term. It may suggest organized religion in a later sense that did not yet exist. Yet the architecture clearly exceeds ordinary domestic use. It is not a village house. It is not a simple shelter. It gathers symbols, labor, and space into something charged. The old words strain under the weight of the new evidence. One lesser-known part of the rediscovery is that excavation reveals not only grand enclosures, but also the enormous difficulty of interpreting fill. The material packed into the structures is not a clean closing layer. It includes bones, stones, tools, and debris from human activity, creating a dense archive of behavior and confusion. Each deposit may contain material older or younger than the structure around it. Dating must be handled carefully. A bone in the fill can help establish when filling occurred, but it may not date the first moment of construction exactly. A tool found near a pillar may belong to building, use, burial, or later disturbance. Archaeology advances through this careful uncertainty. The site becomes famous, but fame does not make the evidence simple. As word of the discovery spreads, the mound enters a second life, not as a hidden sanctuary but as a modern symbol. It attracts archaeologists, journalists, travellers, documentary makers, and people hungry for origins. With attention comes both insight and exaggeration. The site begins to appear in discussions of the birth of religion, the rise of farming, the first temples, lost civilizations, and even unsupported claims about forgotten advanced peoples. The serious evidence is already astonishing enough. It does not need fantasy to matter. What survives in the record suggests a human achievement of immense depth communities before cities raising monumental carved spaces and then burying them with care. The rediscovery by modern eyes, therefore, is not a single moment of triumph, but a slow correction of vision. First the hill is seen and misunderstood, then it is reconsidered, then the ground is opened, then the stones begin to speak in the only way they can, through position, carving, material, and context. The result is not a complete answer, but a transformed question. What kind of society builds this before kings? What kind of belief organizes labor before writing? What kind of memory buries its most powerful places? The mound that once hid beneath grass and dust becomes a landmark in the study of human beginnings. Not because it explains everything, but because it proves that the beginning was stranger, richer, and more creative than the old story allowed. Once the first shock of rediscovery fades, the harder work begins. A buried temple is not understood simply because its stones are visible again. The impressive image of upright pillars can mislead, because wonder tends to rush ahead of evidence. Archaeology has to slow the scene down and ask less glamorous questions. Which layer came first? Which bones belong to the time of use? And which belong to the time of burial? Were the pillars carved before they were raised? After they were raised? Or in stages did all the enclosures function at the same time? Or did one generation cover what another had built? How old is the fill? How old is the architecture? And how much older are the ideas behind it? The site becomes famous because of its mystery, but its real power lies in the patient scrutiny of fragments. Dating is one of the first battlegrounds of interpretation. The stones themselves cannot be radiocarbon dated in the ordinary way, because limestone is far older than the people who shaped it. Instead, archaeologists depend on organic material found in associated layers, charcoal, bone, plant remains, and other traces that once belonged to living things. These can provide dates for activity around the enclosures or for the filling events that sealed them. But such dates must be handled carefully. A bone deposited in fill may date the material used to bury a space, not the exact moment the pillar was first erected. Charcoal may come from wood burned during use, from later disturbance, or from material gathered from elsewhere. The evidence remains incomplete, and every date has to be tied to context, not simply displayed like a label on a museum wall. The soil layers are equally important. To an untrained eye, fill may look like dirt and rubble. To an archaeologist, it is a sequence of decisions. Changes in colour, density, stone size, bone concentration, tool scatter, and sediment texture can reveal whether material accumulated gradually, was dumped quickly, or came from particular activity zones. Some layers may represent the use of the enclosure, others may represent deliberate closing, others may reflect erosion, collapse, or later disturbance. In a place where the burial itself is part of the mystery, the fill is not background material. It is one of the main texts, written without words in packed earth, broken stone, and animal remains. Tools provide another line of evidence. The builders use stone tools, especially flint implements, to shape limestone and perform daily tasks. Flint blades, scrapers, points, and debris from toolmaking help reveal the technical world surrounding the sanctuary. A scatter of flakes may show where people prepared tools nearby, where patterns can suggest cutting, scraping, butchering, or working hard materials. Hammerstones and other heavy tools help explain how limestone could be pecked and shaped without metal. None of these objects look as dramatic as the pillars, but they are the practical foundation of the monument. They remind us that the temple was not made by magic, nor by lost machinery, but by repeated skill preserved in hands, habits, and communities. Animal bones deepen the story and complicate it at the same time. Large quantities of wild animal remains suggest feasting, hunting, and gathering on a significant scale. Gazelles appear prominently in many interpretations, along with wild cattle, boar, birds, and other species. But bones are not simple witnesses. A concentration of remains may reflect meals eaten by workers, ritual feasts, refuse used as fill, or a mixture of events separated by time. Cut marks can show butchery. Burning can show cooking or disposal. Species selection can suggest hunting choices, symbolic preference, seasonality, or availability in the environment. Scholars still debate how to connect the animal remains with the carved animals on the pillars. The relationship is tempting, but not always direct. A creature eaten in large numbers is not necessarily the same as a creature honoured in stone. Architecture gives some of the strongest clues because it records intention at large scale. The enclosures are not shapeless piles of stone. Their plans reveal repeated forms, circular or oval spaces, stone walls, benches, perimeter pillars, and central T-shaped pillars set with striking emphasis. This repetition suggests shared rules, or at least a shared architectural language. At the same time, the enclosures are not identical copies. Their differences matter. One may be larger, another more heavily carved, another differently preserved, another built or filled at a different time. The site appears to grow through phases, and that growth suggests a living tradition rather than a single construction event. What survives in the record suggests continuity, experiment, and renewal. The pillars themselves are evidence of both engineering and symbol. Tool marks reveal shaping. Sockets and packing stones show how uprights were held in place. Broken or unfinished pillars help reconstruct the process from quarry to enclosure. Carvings placed at particular heights suggest they were meant to be seen from within the space, not merely admired as isolated art. Arms and hands on some pillars imply that at least certain stones were conceived as body-like forms. Yet the absence of faces continues to frustrate interpretation. No single explanation fully accounts for why the most human-like presences are also the most withheld. The architecture gives clues, but not answers complete enough to close the case. One lesser-known issue is that preservation can create illusion, because buried features survive better than exposed ones. The parts archaeologists uncover may not represent the entire original world of the site. Wooden structures, woven screens, hides, painted surfaces, temporary shelters, poles, baskets, cords, and plant offerings may have existed but vanished completely. Colour may have mattered, smell may have mattered, sound may have mattered. The stone architecture is the strongest survivor, but it may once have been only one element in a richer sensory setting. This means the temple as seen today is both extraordinary and incomplete. Its most durable materials dominate our imagination because time has removed the softer ones. As the evidence is tested, the site becomes less simple and more impressive. It is not merely old, it is structured, it is not merely symbolic, it is practical. It is not merely a temple in the later sense. It is a gathering place, quarry project, feasting centre, artistic environment, and buried archive of social change. Each category captures part of it and fails to capture all of it. That is why careful archaeology matters. Without dating, the stones become timeless mystery. Without tool analysis, they become impossible. Without bones, the gatherings lose their human weight. Without soil layers, the burial becomes a vague disappearance. Without architectural study, the enclosures become isolated curiosities instead of parts of a long tradition. Under scrutiny, the buried temple does not become less mysterious. It becomes mysterious in a better way. The unsupported fantasies fall away, but the real questions grow sharper. The evidence shows that people before full urban civilization could organize labor, carve powerful images, gather in large numbers, and reshape a ridge into a sacred landscape. It also shows that they closed and buried that landscape in ways still not fully understood. The stones are no longer silent objects pulled from dirt. They are connected to tools, bones, sediments, quarry scars, dates, and patterns of building. Together, those traces do not give a single neat answer. They give something more valuable, a grounded mystery, one strong enough to survive careful examination. The more carefully the evidence is studied, the harder it becomes to force the buried temple into one simple explanation. At first, the temptation is strong. A place with massive pillars and animal carvings must be a temple. A place with many bones must be a feasting centre. A place with faceless human-like stones must be tied to ancestors. A place built before farming must somehow explain the birth of agriculture. Each idea catches part of the truth, but each one becomes too narrow if it tries to rule alone. The site resists a single label because the people who made it did not divide life into modern categories: food, labour, death, memory, power, animals, landscape, and belief may have belonged to one continuous field of meaning. The temple explanation remains the most familiar, and for good reason. The enclosures do not look domestic. They are not ordinary houses, storage rooms, or animal pens. Their central pillars create a focus that feels ceremonial. Their carvings carry symbolic weight. Their repeated construction suggests a tradition larger than daily convenience. If a temple means a special place where human communities gather around powers beyond ordinary life, then the word fits well enough. But if temple implies priests in robes, fixed doctrines, named gods, and organized worship like later religions, then it becomes misleading. Scholars still debate how far the term can be stretched before it smuggles later assumptions into a much older world. Another explanation sees the site as a gathering centre where ritual and social bonding mattered more than worship in the later sense. In this view, the ridge draws groups together from across the surrounding landscape. They hunt, feast, exchange goods, arrange alliances, share stories, and work on the stones. The enclosures are not isolated shrines but social engines, places where scattered communities become temporarily larger than themselves. This idea fits the evidence for large-scale food consumption and collective labour. It also explains why monument building might emerge before cities. People do not need kings if the work is powered by seasonal obligation, prestige, shared belief, and the promise of feasting. Yet this explanation can become too practical if it reduces the carvings and pillars to social decoration. The architecture feels charged in ways that simple alliance-making does not fully explain. A third interpretation places ancestors and the dead closer to the centre. The faceless pillars with carved arms and hands may represent powerful beings, perhaps ancestral figures transformed into stone. In the broader early Neolithic world, human remains are sometimes treated in ways that suggest intense concern with memory, identity, and the continuing presence of the dead. Skulls may be removed, curated, plastered, buried, or displayed at other sites, though practices vary widely. The buried temple could belong to this larger world of death and remembrance. Dangerous animals carved around the enclosures might mark boundaries between the living and the dead, or between human society and forces beyond it. The evidence remains incomplete, however, and the site does not provide a clear mortuary pattern simple enough to settle the matter. Some researchers emphasize feasting as the key. The huge quantities of wild animal bone suggest that gatherings involve substantial consumption. Food may have paid for labour, created social debts, and turned difficult construction into memorable events. The act of eating together can be politically powerful even without formal rulers. It can create generosity, rivalry, obligation, and reputation. A person or group able to provide meat for many others gains influence. A great hunt followed by building and ceremony could bind communities through both stomach and symbol. No single explanation fully accounts for the site, but feasting almost certainly belongs somewhere in the story. The question is whether it explains the monument, or whether it served a deeper ritual purpose that required the feast. There is also the idea of territorial marking. A high ridge with broad views can become a statement in the landscape. The stones may have announced that certain groups belong to this region, or that the region belonged to a shared sacred tradition. In a time of climatic change, growing populations, and increasing attachment to particular places, such a monument could help define identity. It may have said, without writing, that this hill mattered, that people returned here. That memory had weight, yet a purely territorial explanation feels too thin. The carvings are too strange, the burial too deliberate, the central pillars too carefully staged. The site may mark place, but it also transforms place into something more than a boundary. Other proposals look to shamanic practice, initiation, mythic storytelling, or encounters with altered states. The animal imagery, the faceless beings, and the enclosed spaces could fit a world where ritual specialists mediate between humans and non-human powers. Perhaps the carvings represent spirit animals, dangerous helpers, or mythic episodes known to those who gathered there. Such interpretations are possible, but difficult to prove. Prehistoric symbolism often invites confident stories from modern observers, and confidence can easily outrun the evidence. What survives in the record suggests a powerful symbolic system, but not the spoken myths that would make it readable. The most disputed explanations are the ones that detach the temple from its archaeological setting. Popular theories sometimes claim it records a comet impact, encodes a lost astronomical message, preserves knowledge from an advanced vanished civilization, or proves outside intervention by beings not part of ordinary human history. These ideas gain attention because the site is old, impressive, and mysterious. But age and mystery are not evidence for unsupported claims. The stones can be extraordinary without being impossible. The builders can be prehistoric without being helpless. The carvings can be symbolic without being a secret scientific code. Mainstream archaeology does not reject wonder. It rejects conclusions that ignore context, dating, tools, bones, and the human capacities already visible in the evidence. A more careful explanation may be less dramatic but more profound. The buried temple was likely many things at once: a sacred gathering place, a stage for ritual performance, a centre of feasting, a monument of social cooperation, a landscape of animal symbolism, and perhaps a place where the living negotiated with ancestors or forces beyond human control. Its meaning may have changed over generations. One enclosure may not have served the exact same role as another. A pillar raised in one period may have been understood differently by those who later buried it. The site was not frozen even in its own time. It lived, accumulated, transformed, and finally disappeared under the material of its own memory. That layered nature is what makes the competing explanations valuable. They do not simply cancel one another, they circle the same mystery from different sides. The temple may have helped communities manage social pressure, but through sacred experience. It may have supported feasting, but feasting may have been inseparable from ritual obligation. It may have honoured ancestors, but ancestors may have been imagined through animal powers and faceless stone bodies. It may have encouraged settlement and farming, but not as a planned invention. The ridge gathered meanings before later civilizations separated them into religion, politics, economy, art, and architecture. So the buried temple remains unresolved not because nothing can be known, but because what can be known is complex. The evidence rules out simplicity. It shows human beings before cities, creating a place of astonishing effort and symbolic density. It shows wild animals carved into permanence at the edge of domestication. It shows open enclosures filled and closed with deliberate care. It shows social power without named rulers, sacred architecture without writing, and memory without explanation. The best interpretation may be one that accepts the site as a convergence rather than a puzzle with one hidden answer. The temple is not a code waiting for a single key. It is a surviving fragment of a world in which many keys were held by people whose voices are gone. The buried temple changes the human origin story not because it proves that everything once believed was wrong, but because it makes the old sequence too small. For generations, the rise of civilization was often imagined as a staircase: first farming, then villages, then surplus, then hierarchy, then temples, then cities, then writing. The staircase still has value, because agriculture really does transform human life, and cities really do create new kinds of power. But the stones beneath the hill reveal that human beings were already building shared worlds before they climbed all the expected steps. Religion, ritual, cooperation, and symbolic imagination were not late decorations added after survival became easy. They may have been among the forces that pulled people toward new forms of society in the first place. This is a difficult adjustment because it asks us to treat prehistoric belief as historically active. Belief is often described as something invisible, something soft compared with tools, food, walls, and bones. Yet the temple shows belief becoming heavy. It becomes limestone dragged across a ridge. It becomes carved animals, central pillars, circular spaces, feasting debris, repeated labor, and deliberate burial, whatever the builders thought they were doing. Their ideas had consequences in the physical world. They organized bodies, they consumed time, they required food, they shaped the landscape. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is enough to show that imagination was not separate from survival. It was one of the ways survival became social. The site also changes how cooperation is understood. Modern people often assume that large projects require command from above. Someone must order the work. Someone must control the food. Someone must punish refusal. Later states certainly build that way, and many monuments of the ancient world are tied to kings, taxation, and forced labor. But the buried temple appears before that kind of state power. Its builders may have had leaders, ritual specialists, prestigious families, or influential organizers, but they leave no evidence of monarchy. Their cooperation may have grown from shared obligation rather than centralized command. This does not make the work gentle or equal in any simple sense. Social pressure can be powerful. Prestige can compel. Ritual fear can motivate. But it suggests that complex coordination can emerge before bureaucracy, and that human groups can organize immense effort around meaning as well as authority. Labor itself becomes more mysterious and more human. To cut a pillar from limestone, move it, raise it, carve it, gather around it, and later bury it is not efficient in the narrow sense. It does not produce more calories directly. It does not shelter a household from rain. It does not store grain. Yet it may help create the conditions under which larger communities trust one another, remember one another, and return to the same place. Labor spent on the sacred can become labor spent on society. A person who helps raise a pillar may gain identity, obligation, honor, or belonging. The monument consumes energy, but it also produces a social memory that outlasts a meal, a hunt, or a season. This has consequences for the history of settlement. The temple stands near a world in which people are beginning to spend more time in particular places, using wild plants intensively, storing food, and experimenting with new forms of dwelling. The old contrast between wandering foragers and settled farmers becomes too blunt. The people around the temple may have been both mobile and attached. both hunters and builders, both gatherers of wild food and creators of enduring places. What survives in the record suggests that settlement was not only an economic adjustment, it was also emotional and ritual. People may have stayed closer to certain places because those places held the dead, the stories, the stones, the feasts, and the obligations that made a community recognizable to itself. The beginning of complex society therefore becomes less like a practical invention and more like a tightening web. Wild grain encourages return. Return encourages memory. Memory encourages ritual. Ritual encourages gathering. Gathering demands food. Food demands planning. Planning encourages storage and settlement. Settlement creates new pressures, new conflicts, new possibilities, and new inequalities. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation, but the temple shows how many strands may have been braided together. Civilization does not begin only when people learn how to grow wheat. It begins, in part, when people create reasons to gather in numbers large enough that growing wheat becomes increasingly useful. The sanctuary also challenges the assumption that religion becomes elaborate only after daily life grows secure. In a harsh and changing environment, ritual may be one way people face insecurity. The carved animals, many of them dangerous or wild, suggest a world in which humans are not yet imagining themselves as masters of nature. They stand among forces that must be watched, feared, honored, and perhaps negotiated with. The temple may have helped communities make sense of death, danger, climate shifts, animal movement, and social tension. Scholars still debate the exact meanings of the images, but the broader lesson is clear symbolic life can intensify during uncertainty, not merely after uncertainty disappears. There is a lesser-known humility in this revision of origins. It restores intelligence to people who left no writing. The builders did not need alphabets to think abstractly. They did not need kings to cooperate. They did not need cities to imagine permanence. Their knowledge was stored in practice, landscape, body memory, seasonal movement, tool-making, carving, and repeated gatherings, because their world did not preserve names. Later history nearly mistook them for background figures in the rise of agriculture. The buried temple forces them back into the center of the story, not as mysterious superhumans, and not as simple ancestors waiting to become civilized, but as people already engaged in one of humanity's most difficult tasks, creating shared meaning strong enough to organize life. At the same time, the temple warns against replacing one rigid story with another. It does not prove that religion alone caused agriculture, or that temples alone created villages, or that one sacred hill explains the entire Neolithic revolution. The transformation from foraging to farming happened unevenly across many landscapes, through many experiments, failures, adaptations, and local choices. But the site does prove that the old boundary between practical life and symbolic life is false. Food and belief, labor and memory, animals and architecture, climate and ritual, all press against one another. Human origins are not only a story of tools becoming better, they're a story of gatherings becoming larger, places becoming heavier with meaning, and communities learning to bind themselves to futures they could not yet see. The buried temple changes the beginning by making it feel less mechanical and more alive. It shows that before the first great cities, there were already people capable of turning a hill into a sacred landscape. Before writing, there were signs. Before kings, there was organized labor. Before farms fully remade the world, there were gatherings that may have helped make farms necessary. The stones do not give a complete origin story. They do something more important. They widen the doorway into the human past, and beyond it. The beginning of civilization no longer looks like a single invention. It looks like a long, uncertain convergence of hunger, fear, imagination, cooperation, and the need to make time stand still in stone. The legacy of the hidden sanctuary begins with a reversal of expectation. It does not leave behind a royal name to memorize, a battle to date, or a law code to translate. It leaves behind a hill that was not what it seemed, stones that looked impossible, only because the people who made them had been underestimated, and carvings that continue to watch from the edge of understanding. Its importance is not that it solves the beginning of civilization, but that it makes the beginning larger. It forces the human story to include builders who lived before kings, artists who worked before writing, organizers who gathered labor before bureaucracy, and communities whose sacred imagination was strong enough to reshape a ridge and then bury the results so completely that time itself became part of the monument. In the present, the temple stands exposed again, but it will never be exactly what it was. The sunlight that falls on the pillars now is not the same light that once moved across them during ritual gatherings. The people who walk near them today arrive with cameras, notebooks, conservation plans, security barriers, and modern questions. They do not bring the old songs, the old fears, the old obligations, or the old animal stories. The site has re-entered the world, but as archaeology, as heritage, as mystery, and as evidence. That is a different kind of life. The sanctuary is no longer sealed in darkness, yet it remains partly hidden because the deepest layer of its meaning was never buried in soil. It was carried in minds that are gone. Its legacy also lies in caution. A discovery this powerful attracts exaggeration almost immediately. The older the stones seem, the more some people want to detach them from the human communities that built them. But the more carefully the evidence is studied, the more remarkable the human explanation becomes. There is no need for vanished machines or impossible visitors. Stone tools, skilled hands, social pressure, ritual obligation, feasting, memory, and patience are enough. That may sound modest until one imagines the work bodies pulling in heat and dust, limestone resisting every blow, animals butchered for gatherings, images carved stroke by stroke, and pillars raised in a world that has not yet invented the state. The unsupported fantasies make the builders smaller by refusing to believe they were capable. Archaeology gives them back their power. The sanctuary's influence spreads beyond its own ridge. It changes how nearby sites are read, how early Neolithic communities are imagined, and how scholars think about the relationship between ritual and settlement. Other places in the region, with their own pillars, buildings, carvings, and strange deposits, become part of a broader conversation. The buried temple is no longer a lonely miracle. It belongs to a landscape of experimentation in which people are testing new ways to gather, build, remember, and live. The evidence remains incomplete, and each site has its own history. But together they suggest that the early Neolithic was not a quiet prelude to civilization. It was already an age of invention. There is a surprising fragility in this legacy. Stone feels permanent, yet once uncovered, it becomes vulnerable again. Rain, temperature change, erosion, tourism, excavation itself, and even the simple exposure to air can threaten what burial preserved. Conservation becomes a modern responsibility placed upon an ancient act of concealment. The same mound that once protected the pillars had to be opened so the world could learn from them. But opening creates new risks. Every ancient site carries this tension. To know it, one must disturb it. To protect it, one may have to cover, limit, shelter, or leave parts untouched. What survives in the record is never the whole past, and what survives into the future depends on choices made now. The temple also leaves behind a deeper emotional legacy. It reminds us that civilization is not only made from practical needs. People do not gather merely because they require calories. They gather because certain places become charged with memory, fear, hope, rivalry, grief, and belonging. They build because the invisible can become urgent enough to demand weight. They carve because animals, ancestors, dangers, and stories press against the mind until stone becomes a surface for thought. They bury because endings, too, can be sacred. No single explanation fully accounts for the sanctuary, but its very complexity feels true to human life. Important places are rarely only one thing. Perhaps this is why the hidden sanctuary continues to hold attention. It sits at a threshold that still feels familiar. Even across 11,000 years, its builders face a changing climate, shifting food systems, social pressures, and the difficult task of creating bonds larger than immediate family or camp. Modern people face different changes, but the need to make meaning under uncertainty has not disappeared. The forms have changed. The pillars are no longer raised in the same way. The animals no longer carry the same symbolic force. Yet the impulse to gather around shared signs, to build places that outlast the individual, to turn fear and wonder into structure, remains deeply human. The temple's final legacy may be humility before deep time. It shows how much can vanish without truly disappearing. A whole world of gestures, beliefs, names, and voices can be lost, while a few stones remain to overturn assumptions thousands of years later. It shows that history is not only what people wrote down. History is also what they cut into bedrock, what they dragged across a hill, what they ate together, what they buried, and what they forgot so thoroughly that the forgetting itself became a layer of earth. The sanctuary is not a complete message from the past. It is a survival, and survivals are rarely complete, but it is enough to change the silence around it. So the lost temple buried for thousands of years leaves us with no final answer, and that may be its most honest gift. It does not tell us exactly what the fox meant, or why the scorpion waited on the stone, or who first placed hands on the pillar's sides, or what people felt when the enclosure was filled for the last time. It tells us something wider and perhaps more important before cities, before kings, before writing. Human beings were already capable of immense cooperation, symbolic depth, and deliberate memory. Beneath an ordinary hill, they left a sanctuary that survived by disappearing, and when it returned, it did not simply add another monument to the ancient world. It changed the shape of the doorway through which we look back at ourselves. The hill is quiet again, but it is no longer ordinary. Once, it hid its stones so completely that wind and grass could pass over it without giving the secret away. Now the secret is partly open, though never fully surrendered. The pillars stand in the modern light like survivors from a dream older than cities, older than written memory, older than the first royal names people carved to prove they had mattered. They do not explain themselves. They do not need to. Their silence is part of their power. What remains is the feeling of distance, not distance measured only in years, though the years are almost impossible to hold in the mind. 11,000 years is not simply a number. It is countless mornings over the ridge, countless seasons of rain and heat, countless animals moving through grass, countless human lives appearing and vanishing without leaving a name. It is the slow replacement of one world by another, hunters becoming villagers, wild grains becoming crops, sacred gatherings becoming settlements, settlements becoming towns, and towns eventually becoming the worlds that call themselves history. The buried temple reminds us that human beings have always lived between need and meaning. They need food, water, shelter, and safety. But they also need places that hold fear, memory, grief, wonder, and belonging. Long before written prayers, long before carved laws, long before kings claimed the right to speak for gods, people were already looking at stone, animal, sky, and earth, and making something that could outlast them. They did not know that one day strangers would uncover their work and call it ancient. They did not build for museums, documentaries, or timelines. They built for reasons close to them, urgent to them and now mostly unreachable. And perhaps that is why the temple still feels alive. Its mystery is not empty. It is the shape left behind when real human meanings have passed beyond recovery. The fox remains, but not the story of the fox. The hands remain, but not the name of the being they belong to. The circles remain, but not the footsteps, smoke, hunger, songs, or silence that once filled them. Archaeology brings the stones back into light, but time keeps the final words. So the image that lingers is simple: a ridge under a wide sky, limestone warmed by the sun, carved animals waiting on pale surfaces, and beneath every answer, another layer of earth. A temple was built, used, buried, forgotten, and found again. Civilizations rose after it and disappeared after it, yet the hidden sanctuary endured in darkness, holding its quiet place at the edge of the human beginning.